Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we're doing a new SSD for our series of PS5 SSD expansion tests, and today it's been a little while waiting for it, and I know a lot of you have requested it. It is the ADATA XPG GAMMIX S70 Blade. Now, for those that aren't aware, we've already looked at a very similar SSD to this, the ADATA XPG GAMMIX S70. It had quite a chunky little heatsink there. We've done numerous tests with that SSD. I think we've done 5 rounds of tests on it, and it has done remarkably well. But as a number of you are aware, that big chunky heatsink that it arrives with, as beautifully unique and well designed for cooling as it is, it does not fit inside the PS5's M.2 NVMe slot. It results in you having to have that heatsink installed, but without the plate on top, with the potential, but not confirmed, but potential for interrupting the negative air pressure inside the PS5. So a number of you have requested, and I say a number of you, a lot of you have requested the Blade version. So we're doing a number of those same tests again on this SSD, but I should highlight a few things straight off the bat. I am utilizing the Blade version that arrives with a graphene plate instead of a larger heatsink. It's a single-use adhesive graphene plate that attaches to the top of the SSD, which is remarkably thin. Now, a number of you will be inquiring what exactly you'll be doing about heat dissipation in this video. We are going to heavily rely on the graphene plate on its own. We have already tried to install this SSD inside the PS5 with the Spiderman PS5 heatsink on top. I'm pleased to confirm that both with a thermal pad between the graphene plate on the GAMMIX S70 Blade and the Spiderman heatsink, it fit, as well as utilizing it without the thermal padding. And of course, we will be doing temperature testing on that later on, as well as a flat face-off video for the games loading on this SSD versus the GAMMIX non-Blade version. We're going to have about 10 tests and a flat face-off between these two SSDs to see which one is the better. And I should also highlight that this video is only utilizing the XPG Blade with the graphene heat plate. We are not utilizing that Spiderman PS5 heatsink, because even though it works and it fit, when we think it would offset the result too much. So for this video, we're only using the ADATA XPG GAMMIX S70 Blade with graphene thin plate, nothing else, and we've replaced the lid on that M.2 slot with the PS5's own little cover on there. So again, we will do temp testing, and I know this has been a long intro, but I just wanted to make it abundantly clear to you guys what the cooling system we're going with here. This SSD fits, but I don't have the same amount of credence in that heatsink compared with the big chunky one on the non-Blade model. But for now, let's format this SSD and get a benchmark. The PS5 previously did 6,235 megabytes per second on the non-Blade version. So let's see how that compares. Remember, 6,235, and we've got a lower benchmark there of a little over 6,000 megabytes per second there. Again, 6,000 is still absolutely great. It's more than 500 clear of the recommended minimum 5,500. But again, two SSDs here, both at 1 terabyte, and this SSD had a slightly lower benchmark there. So the first thing we're going to do is make our way into the storage manager on the PS5, and we're going to transfer over a lot of games. We're going to move over 8 games, 4 of which for this video and 4 of which for another video, and all of these games are the ones that are going to be utilized in both the face-off between both versions of this SSD and in future face-offs that we've got planned against some of the newer generation SSDs that we've tested in the last few weeks. As you can see, there is the Blade version there, and there is our storage there, a little over 1 terabyte there. You've got to factor in over provisioning. So again, we're going to be moving over a big old pile of games, and we're going to be bench testing 4 of them in this video and 4 of them in an upcoming video. But we're going to do it now just to get a little lowdown on those writes and reads. So those are the 8 games we're moving over. So again, in today's video, we're going to be looking at Spider-Man Miles Morales, Lego World, Deathloop, and Call of Duty, the main face-off fight there, Warzone. And in the following video, we're going to be looking at Spiderman Remastered, Ghosts of Tsushima, Rocket League, and Last of Us Part 2. So let's move these games over. And while it does that, let's take a little moment to talk a little bit about this SSD. It takes advantage of the Grit controller. Not a lot of SSDs in the market right now take advantage of that. Most 7,000 megs PCIe Gen 4x4 SSDs utilize that Phison E18 controller. You know, I think the market share is at least 4 or even 5 to 1 in terms of controller use. It's still a great controller there. And again, due to its relative rareness, you'd think it would cost more, but all of the SSDs I have seen, such as the Patriot Viper and the series of the XPGs here, all of those are a much more affordable alternative to some of these E18 SSDs, despite the fact that the sequential read and write outside of PS5 benchmarks and looking at traditional PC benchmarks are higher both in read and write. Also, that affordable price point isn't just affordable comparing 1TB, 2TB and more between Grit controller SSDs and the Phison E18 SSDs, but on top of that, every single Grit SSD I have ever seen so far all include heatsinks. The majority of E18 controller SSDs, if they do include a heatsink, are generally more expensive. Whereas the Grit ones are a higher performing SSD with IOPS ranging from between 800,000 to 1 million, but at the same time all arriving at a lower price point inclusive of a heatsink. But we're going to fast forward things here. We've talked about it before. Transition of data between the internal M.2 SSD, the internal PS5 SSD, and the external M.2 SSD, such as in this case the Blade. There's something happening in the middle, be it compression, encryption, something. But regardless, when we're moving these games over, they're definitely taking longer than they should because the PS5 is doing some kind of activity in the middle that bottlenecks it. So we do not measure these games by how long it takes to transfer the data, because nearly all the SSDs that I've done so far have taken the same amount of time to transfer these 8 games. So what I'm going to do is fast forward to the completion of this transfer, and then we're going to load into the first game, and then we're going to go through each of the tests, talking about why we picked each game, their inherent benefits, and comparing their performance against that of the internal PS5. Let's fast forward to the completion of this transfer. Right, so now that transfer has completed and the game should all be residing on that Blade, we can start making our way into our first game. Let's check M.2 SSD storage. There are all of our lovely games all transferred on there. So, first game we're going to go into is Spider-Man Miles Morales, one of the launch titles for the PS5. And this is going to be using Fidelity mode, which means that the the game is going to be running at 30 frames per second, but with all of the graphical enhancements, ray tracing, all of the textures, more and more like that. We're not seeing any problems with the SSD right now. Again, my only concern I've had so far is how hot this SSD is going to get. I've seen nothing like that yet, despite that heavy write activity that we just performed there. If you do hear that noise in the background there, that's just the game authenticating via the disk. It doesn't load from the disk. There's no data being pulled from the disk. It's all internal. So let's go ahead and begin our test. We're going to load into the city and go from there in 3, 2, 1. Should be nice and quick. And we are into the game. Again, what we're looking to do is try and move through the game as fast as possible to try and force the game, if it has any difficulties with regards to loading those textures or keeping up with the frame rate, to expose itself there. And again, we do this in 2 ways. The first one is moving very fast through the streets of the city. And again, what I want you guys to do when you're watching this is don't look so much at the main character. Don't look at Miles Morales. Look at, in the distance, textures being introduced. Have a look at the pop of graphics and all that being done in the background, things that are being introduced and more. The other way in which we test this game is to get lots of graphics loaded up on the ground level and then get nice and high with the camera pointed right down to force the game into introducing those assets. swapping out the high density assets for low density assets, and then quickly reintroducing them as quickly as possible to show any struggle. Once again, you need to be looking at the periphery. Don't look at the Miles Morales character there. You need to be looking at in the distance and around the edges of the screen as these elements are being introduced in and out, and how they compare against the same activities happening there on the internal PS5 SSD to see if there's any texture pop there. So we're nice and high up. Let's force ourselves down nice and low. But for now, that's still seemingly loading. Lovely and quick, no drop in the frame rate. Lovely stuff indeed. Okay, we'll move on to our second test of this game, where we're going to be doing some fast travel activity. So what we do is, right now we're on the lowest point on the island. So what we're doing is making our way up to the very top. We're fast traveling to a subway area, and then from there we see if it loads just as quick or faster than the internal PS5 SSD in 3, 2, 1. And once we arrive there, we want to fast travel, move around the map as fast as possible to stop the game from having much time to take a bit of a breather. We want to move as fast as possible. And again, same thing we were doing before. I need you guys to look at the peripherals right around the edges of the camera there as these textures get swapped out, because the main focus is the player. They're going to be concentrating on the middle. So again, see how it compares against the PS5 internal SSD as we're forcing ourselves around to the edges of the game to see how it compares between that and the ADATA XPG blade. So let's move fast all the way through. Got hit by a truck, why not? But yes, I would say that's running absolutely fine there. And overall, quite pleased with what we're seeing here. So let's go ahead and make our way out of this game and into our next test game, which is Lego Worlds. Right, so we're making our way into Lego Worlds, and again, we're going to do the same thing we've done in previous tests. The first thing we want to do is just load up the kind of save game we kind of have to do in this game, and then we're going to load straight into the sandbox mode of Lego Worlds. A PS4 title, it's a kind of open world sandbox game as it is, like a middle ground between Minecraft and No Man's Sky. It's a lot of kind of early sequential heavy data, and then loads and loads and loads of small data. You notice that with the loading, that it's a sort of game with a lot of its loading percentages and bars on screen, that you see big chunk data, and then all of a sudden the individual percentages will just rain on. And again, this becomes more apparent when you're loading into some other kind of loading into the game world areas, with the big chunk world data is passed through a great deal easier. So it's going to be interesting to see how the blade deals with a lot of that activity. So if we make our way over to here, we can open up the sandbox mode, and then from there we're going to create a brand new sandbox mode. And again, this sandbox is going to take advantage of the largest area of terrain. It's also going to utilize every single biome, so that means that the game is going to have to introduce a random element as it procedurally generates the world each time. And again, once we've got this world ready, we're going to load into it, and then from there we're going to kind of transition around the available area to see how well the game handles it. So let's go in 3, 2, 1. And this is going to load us into the game. Again, top right is the SSD, the XPG blade, and top left is that internal PS5 SSD. Take a little note of those percentages as well, because that's where you'll kind of see the difference there in the handling of sequential data, and then the handling of the slightly more random and small data rather than the big chunky stuff there. And again, we're moving in. There's going to be that transition again, something akin to No Man's Sky as it introduces us into the world. And then from there, as soon as we're on the ground level, I'll open up the creative mode so we can, grow some transport and transition around the map while flicking in between the inside and the outside view to double check that all of the textures are still being managed as well as possible. But for now, we're loading into a kind of snowfield area here. So let's make our way out of that and start introducing as quick as possible a lot of the random elements there. So let's get ourselves a vehicle to take to the skies. Let's go for something a little bit more interesting there. So let's go with I don't know about a space gear. Let's go with an airstrike ship, whatever that is. So again, all we're looking to do is transition and make our way around this map and force the game to have to introduce some of those new elements as we make our way into the different biomes. And again, we can move the camera directly in, and then if we get a nice straight run, look around, and we can see that the textures are running absolutely fine all our way around. Again, we'll move around to the area a little bit there. But again, everything's nice and sharp. They're exactly what I would expect within this game. Again, we will make our way around the map a little bit until we see maybe a structure. We can introduce our own structures if we choose. And again, I've mentioned this before, but if we zoom the camera out nice and high and move the camera around, you're able to see that behind us the world is being sort of destroyed there, but not just out of the field of view, that draw distance. So seeing these things being introduced into the distance in front of us is not a surprise. That's just how the game controls the visible area that's around you there. Again, we're moving into a new biome area, as you can see there. I was kind of hoping we'd see maybe a structure that we can enter into. Again, we can introduce one ourselves if we choose. This looks like there's random containers, but not really anything I would refer to as habitat that we can make our way into, perhaps just down there. But again, if there's not, we can always just force the game to introduce one for us. So let's just jump out. Again, not really anything of concern there. We've got the inside view, we can move around. A little bit of flicker there, but again, a lot of that is just because of the texture of the game. So if it was popping, that would be a slightly different story. So let's bring ourselves in kind of a large structure, perhaps. Let's go for something nice and big, hopefully. Let's go for a bank, why not? Let's just introduce it right there. And again, the game will just continue building that structure around us. And what we can do is make our way into it, bring on the inside view, and just double check that the game is running fine. So we're going in, things seem to be absolutely fine there. We've got that. The inside elements, the textures are exactly what I would expect. They're lovely and sharp. I'm seeing no kind of texture related issues there that I think are problematic. Again, everything looks the way I would expect it. The game's running fine, it's still sharp, everything's introduced well. Yeah, I would say that it's a success there for there. And again, everything looks the way I would expect it to within the world of the game. And again, we can try to go to outside view to make sure some of the other textures are loading, but it's not going to be that useful given the tight camera angle. But overall, that's run fine for me. I think for now, we can make our way out of this into the next game, Deathloop. Right, so we're loading up Deathloop right now, and what we're going to be looking at here is the frame rate of the game and a swapping out of textures. Again, if you've played the old Dishonored games, you'll know exactly what I'm on about when you do a lot of close combat stuff, much like Doom Eternal as well. They do a great job of swapping those textures out as you get closer, and particularly with the glory kills of Doom. So what we're going to do is load into the game now. It's very early on in the game. Remember, we are only measuring here at the actual physical loading screen because this game has a tendency to introduce a random preload amble that can throw things off. So we're only looking at the loading screen between the Blade SSD and the internal PS5. Let's go in 3, 2, 1. And we're looking at the loading screen there. So we're going to see how they compare. This is a game that's been very diverse in how different SSDs have loaded it. That felt very quick indeed, but again, we won't know for certain how it compared, at least against the internal SSD yet. But for now, I'm just going to start making my way through the game as quick as I can. And again, we are comparing the internal PS5 SSD performance against that of the Blade here. And again, we're looking at the frame rate and we're looking at how textures are introduced. So what we can do here is immediately force the game to sort of bring a bunch of enemies over here so we can force a lot of those close-knit textures within the game very easily. So again, even if we die, it doesn't matter because a death animation will still force us back into an earlier point in the game. So again, we can force the game if it's trying to destroy textures behind us when we load back in. We can go ahead and carry on where we left off and just have an absolute kill spree. But for now, I think that's enough testing of the close textures, and what we'll do is start making our way further into the map environment. And then from there, just make sure the game can maintain that pace as we push forward as quick as we can. So carrying on forward, nice and fast. Carry on. We've got a lot of enemies that have suddenly woke up. This will probably kill me, and then it'll have to force into the earlier environment. But again, that's what we want, to make sure that the game is forced to do a lot of these activities. But for now, I'm seeing nothing here that would make me concerned about the behavior and the performance of this SSD. And again, this is a great example of performance-based gaming, where the games have to move very, very fast based on how you are playing it. But again, even when we get nice and close to those textures, and again, it's slightly cartoony, this game, so you have to bear that in mind. But again, nothing here I'm seeing would make me concerned about the performance of this game, and ultimately, I'm pleased with everything we've seen. So let's make our way out of this and go into our final game, which is Call of Duty, not Warfare, I always get them mixed up, Warzone. Right, so on Warzone we look at the offline mode. So what we do is we go into private match and practice, and a battle royale practice with nothing but bots, but it has to be said that there is still interference from online server connection as the game loads up, something which is really, really difficult to remove. So although this game we do sort of measure the loading, it should be highlighted that the majority of what we're focusing on here is how the game is being played. So let's go in 3, 2, 1. And again, this starts off with an FMV that doesn't use in-game graphics, and then it loads from that into a pre-rendered cutscene that uses in-game graphics, and then finally into an open area where we have control. Once again, I say it before and I say it again, when I'm talking about performance during these comparisons, and I talk about frame rate and texture changes, look at the periphery of the screen. Don't look at the middle, look at the edges and how it compares with the PS5 loading the same game, because that is where you notice the big difference, not in the middle, around the edges. So for example, look at the edges of this area. I won't rotate the camera much, but you can see how trees are being introduced, how those textures are changing as we get closer to areas. Now, that's a very common example of texture swapping and asset management there around the edges of the screen. But when we jump out, that is the other big tell, seeing how the game introduces those elements as we get closer to the ground, and how it controls the management of assets throughout the course of the game while we're moving around. So again, we'll make our way into an area here, and we'll open the parachute maybe a tad earlier than we would have liked. And what we're looking at here is grabbing ourselves a gun, doing a bit of running around, and then we're going to jump in a vehicle to introduce some nice high movement to make sure the game is controlling those assets as well as it can. Again, try to pay more attention to the outside scope rather than the middle of the screen, because the middle of the screen is not going to be a great example of what you're looking for here. You need to be looking at the edges of the screen, and what we need to do first is grab ourselves a gun, otherwise we are not going to last very long at all. Any gun will do, other than that one. But still, nonetheless, let's have a look. You know what you'll have to do instead. Again, that's a fairly basic gun, slightly higher than we had before. But what we're going to do is start making our way. Try and knock this guy and steal whatever the hell he's got, because we might actually find that more useful. And again, now we'll start making our way around the map. So the idea is we're just going to drive as much as we can, keep an eye on those textures and the frame rate as I make my way around, and how the game is being forced to introduce those new textures as much as it can. And again, I'm going to move nice and fast as I can. I kind of wish I had inside view, but still, nonetheless, this is still pretty good as we make our way around. Again, we're going to see some enemies probably around here, but it doesn't matter. But again, I'm not seeing any issues with those textures being drawn in. I'm seeing nothing here that makes me concerned about how the game is pulling in those assets throughout. And overall, I was going to say, pretty pleased with what I'm seeing here. But nonetheless, I think for now we're moving nice and quick, and everything I'm seeing so far gives me nothing to worry about. And also, all the way through this, I've been keeping an extra ear open for the fans on the PS5 to know that that graphene heat shield is doing its job of heat dissipation. Yes, you are predominantly going to be reading from this SSD, and therefore the heat generated will not be anywhere near as heavy as a heavy write situation, or if you were encoding or video editing, but still, it's been pretty impressive and cooling absolutely fine. And I will be doing temp tests, of course, during our comparison. But nonetheless, I'm going to wrap things up there and let's summarize everything we've seen. I've seen no drop in performance so far that would make me, not recommend this SSD. I've done some SSDs in the past where there's either been glaring inconsistencies or the swapping of textures or the obvious slow loading times have been a concern. Everything I've seen so far seems fairly standard, and those loading times where I might have felt, such as Warzone there, where it felt like a tiny delay of what there was, almost certainly the online component server element has definitely been a part of that. Now, but do stay tuned. We, of course, have another test on this SSD, the S70 Blade, coming very, very soon, as well as the big face-off between these two, the Blade version and the non-Blade, to see which one performs better. There was an early benchmark increase there on the XPG non-heatsink version, the non-Blade there, of course, at 6,200 versus the 6,000 on this SSD, but that's not enough. So stay tuned for the big comparison where we really look at those results. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, click like. It helps me understand what I'm doing right and makes each video better than the last. And of course, click subscribe and the bell to be notified as we test more and more SSDs on PS5 and work out what are the best, what are the worst, and which ones are best for your money and your data. I will see you on the next video.